On August 16, 2016, 33-year-old Louis Gampenberger entered the property of 58-year-old Pam Hupp in O'Fallon, Missouri. Louis has been suffering from physical and mental impairments since a car accident a few years earlier. Just a few minutes later, the police received an emergency call. The caller was a distraught Pam Hupp. She reported that the man, who would later be identified as Louis Gampenberger, had attacked her while she was sitting in her car in front of her house. He had threatened her with a knife and tried to force her to drive to the bank to get Russ's money. She then ran into her house, grabbed her gun from the nightstand, and shot the man 5 times. When the police arrive shortly afterward, they find Louis lifeless. Notes are found on him detailing how Louis was supposed to force Pam to get the money and then murder her. The investigators have numerous questions. Who is Russ? What money? And who hired Louis? When they try to question Pam about the incident at the police station a week later, she asks to be allowed to use the restroom briefly. A few minutes later, she is found there, covered in blood. She has literally slit her wrists and throat with a ballpoint pen. Pam Hupp, then still known as Pam Newman, was born on October 10, 1948, in Dellwood, Missouri. She later attended Riverview Gardens High School and married her first husband immediately after graduating. Shortly thereafter, she and her husband had a daughter together. The marriage lasted a total of 6 years before ending in divorce. Shortly thereafter, she met Mark Hupp, married him, and had a son with him. Upon marrying him, she took his surname, and Pam Newman became Pam Hupp. Pam worked as an office clerk at State Farm. There, she met Betsy Faria and became friends with her. In 2010, Pam was unemployed. In the past, she had been fired from several jobs for forging signatures. She also suffered from severe back and leg pain. She shared a close friendship with Betsy until Betsy was diagnosed with breast cancer and her condition began to deteriorate. Since Pam had the time and means to do so, she selflessly began caring for Betsy. In 2011, Betsy learned that there was no longer any chance of recovery. Betsy's greatest concern was that her daughters would be able to lead happy lives after her death. For this reason, she had taken out life insurance some time ago. However, due to differences with her husband, Betsy became worried that he might simply spend the money and the children would end up with nothing. After some consideration and discussions with Pam, Betsy ultimately had the life insurance policy transferred to her friend. She had agreed with Pam that Pam would put the proceeds of the life insurance policy, $150,000, into a savings account until her daughters were old enough to access it. On December 27, 2011, 5 days after Betsy had transferred her life insurance policy to Pam, Russ Faria, Betsy's husband, was at their shared home. He was working from home that day. When he finished work at 5 p.m., he briefly called his wife, who was undergoing chemotherapy at that time. He then went to fill up his car with gas and called his mother at 5:22 p.m. to cancel the dinner they had planned together. He then headed to a small store where he was seen at 5:56 p.m. buying some snacks and drinks. With his purchases, he drove to the home of Michael Corbin, a friend of his. There, he had planned a movie night with 3 other friends. The men usually met once a week to watch movies, eat snacks, and chat. At 9 p.m., the men went their separate ways, and Russ bought a few sandwiches on the way before arriving home around 9:40 p.m. When he entered the house, everything seemed normal at first glance. But after a few steps, he noticed that the floor was covered in bloodstains. Just a few feet further on, he found his wife lying lifeless. Her wrists had been slit down to the bone, and a large, serrated kitchen knife was still lodged in her throat. Russ, who appeared to be in shock, immediately called 911 and said on the phone, distraught, that his wife had killed herself. When the police arrived shortly thereafter, they immediately noticed that something was wrong. The police reconstructed the day before Betsy died. Pam was a great help to them in this, as she was the last person to have seen Betsy alive. Pam had planned to pick Betsy up from her mother's house that day to drive her to chemotherapy. There, she learned that Betsy had already gone to the hospital with another friend. Betsy had also already informed her of this via text message. Nevertheless, Pam made her way to the hospital to pick her up and drove her back home after her treatment. According to her own statements, she dropped her off there around 7 p.m. One day after the crime, the police arrested Russ, who had aroused suspicion with his emergency call. The investigators found it hard to believe that anyone could have misinterpreted such a brutal murder. Russ himself argued that he had been in shock and that Betsy had also already attempted self-harm in the past. But this excuse was not enough for the investigators. They questioned him, and Russ's behavior struck them as odd. While he spoke completely calmly and emotionlessly about his wife's death one moment, he literally lost his temper the next. When Pam was questioned about Russ, she confirmed the investigators' fears. She testified that she believed Russ was capable of the crime. Allegedly, he had often been violent in his relationship with Betsy. Betsy had also told her that he had repeatedly mentioned how much he was looking forward to the life insurance money, and had eventually started playing a grotesque little game with her. During this, he would repeatedly press a pillow over Betsy's face and say things like, "Haha, get used to it. That's what it's like when you die." According to Pam, Betsy had also planned to speak with Russ on the day of her death and suggest that she move closer to her mother on her own. Pam also advises the investigators to check Betsy's laptop. And indeed, the investigators find a document that confirms Pam's statements and makes it clear that Betsy was afraid of her husband. However, the police also noticed that the text document was created in Word 97, a program that isn't installed on Betsy's laptop. They also noticed that it is the only document saved without a username. Nevertheless, the evidence is used against Russ, and he is charged with the murder of his wife on January 4, 2012. Russ is defended in court by attorney Joel Schwartz. He finds it highly suspicious that Pam was the last person to see Betsy alive, especially considering that just 5 days earlier, the life insurance policy had been changed to her name. Pam also cannot provide an alibi. She claims to have spent the evening alone. At 7:20 p.m., she sent a brief text message to Betsy stating that she had arrived home. However, this contradicts her cell phone records. Russ, on the other hand, was able to provide an alibi. He met with friends, filled up his car with gas, and went shopping twice, all of which was recorded by surveillance cameras. The prosecution, however, finds these recordings more suspicious than exculpatory. To them, it appears as though Russ had tried to gather as much evidence as possible for his alleged alibi. In response, Joel Schwartz argues that Russ is wearing the same clothes in the surveillance footage that he was wearing when the police and emergency services arrived. There was no blood on them, which would very likely have been the case in a brutal murder. However, the fact that his blood-soaked slippers were found in the house works against Russ. On November 18, 2013, the trial of Russ Faria begins. 3 days later, on November 21st, the verdict is handed down. Russ is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder. Joel Schwartz files an appeal after the verdict. Pam received the $150,000 from Betsy's life insurance policy, but she didn't deposit it into a savings account as originally agreed. She explains this by saying that her mother Shirley had just died of Alzheimer's, and she simply hadn't gotten around to it yet. However, when Shirley's death is investigated more closely, inconsistencies become apparent here as well. Shirley died after falling from her third-floor balcony. She also had 8 times the normal amount of the drug zolpidem in her blood. Here, too, Pam received a large payout from the life insurance policy after Shirley's death. In Shirley's case, the payout was as much as $500,000. The balcony railing had obviously been tampered with. According to investigators, the bars had been broken out with force. An elderly and frail woman like Shirley would not have had the strength to do that. They could only have broken if she had fallen against them with full force or been pushed. Nevertheless, Shirley's death was never investigated further. It was quickly classified as an accident and the case closed. And this, despite the fact that there is a video of Pam, taken a few months before Shirley's death, in which she says, "My mother is $500,000 that I'll get when she dies." In 2014, a civil lawsuit was filed against Pam. It was initiated by Betsy's daughters. The reason? They never received their mother's money. And they won the case. At the end of the trial, they were awarded $100,000. Shortly thereafter, Russ's appeal was also granted. Joel Schwartz, Russ's lawyer, again points to Pam, who would have had both a motive and the opportunity to kill Betsy. In response, Pam testifies that she saw Russ on the day of the crime at the time of the crime, just as he was getting out of his friend's car. But this statement is easily refuted, as Russ could be seen on surveillance footage at the time in question. Since little credence is now given to Pam's other statements, Russ is acquitted on November 7, 2015. However, the evidence is also insufficient to charge Pam. Nearly a year passes before the incident described in the introduction occurs, on August 16, 2016. 33-year-old Louis Gambenberger dies on Pam's property after allegedly attacking her. Pam claims she had never seen him before. However, investigators notice several pieces of circumstantial evidence that contradict this statement. When they try to question Pam about it a week later, she excuses herself briefly and goes to the bathroom, where she slashes her wrists with a ballpoint pen. Yet she survives, despite the massive blood loss. Pam arrives at the hospital, and so do the police to question her. They had previously noticed that Pam's cell phone had been tracked to Louis's neighborhood just 1 hour before his death. And this despite the fact that Pam had claimed she had never seen him before. Furthermore, Pam had stated that Louis had gotten out of a silver car in which a man with short hair had been sitting in the driver's seat. Her description of the man matches that of Russ Faria. Given their history, the investigators assumed that Pam was upset that Russ had been released from prison and was therefore trying again to pin the blame on him. A few days before Louis's death, a woman had contacted the police with surveillance footage of her driveway. She testified that on August 10th, a blonde woman had come to her and introduced herself as Katie. Katie claimed to be a television producer and asked her if she would like to be part of her show. To do so, she would have had to stage a robbery and then fake an emergency call. The woman found the situation very strange, as Katie had no camera crew with her and could not provide identification. By reviewing the surveillance footage, investigators were able to identify the alleged TV producer as Pam Hupp. It can therefore be assumed that, after failing to convince the resident, she drove on and approached Louis Gampenberger, who was mentally and physically disabled, who accepted her shady offer, believing he was simply filming for a TV show. The notes found among Louis's belongings were written on paper that clearly belonged to Pam herself. Envelopes containing money were also found. Presumably, she intended the fake notes to create the impression that Louis and Russ had worked together and had also killed Betsy together. But this plan backfired. On June 19, 2019, Pam was charged with the murder of Lewis. She continues to insist on her innocence. Betsy's case is also being reinvestigated, and the cause of death for Pam's mother has been changed to undetermined, at least for now. On August 12, 2019, Pam is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of Lewis. She did eventually confess to murdering him. In March 2020, Russ Faria is awarded $2 million in compensation for pain and suffering, as he spent 2 years in prison while innocent. In September 2020, Pam's husband Mark Hupp files for divorce, describing their marriage as irretrievably broken. In July 2021, Pam is finally charged with the murder of Betsy. In 2022, the series The Thing About Pam was released, in which Pam Hupp's crimes were once again explored in detail and reenacted. And that brings us to the end of today's video. What do you think about today's case? Do you think Pam killed her mother too? And what was her motive? Was it really just greed and the tempting life insurance payout? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this case. If you enjoyed the video, please feel free to leave a like, comment, and/or subscribe. Thank you in advance, and thank you for watching. See you in the next video. Ciao.